Nadia, ready?
I'm ready.
Excellent. Hello and welcome to episode 277 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which today covers onboarding in remote teams. And to go through what that might look like in an organization, I am delighted to introduce you to Nadia Vatalidis, who's the Director of People at the company Remote. And she's going to go into some detail about how they onboard newcomers into their organization. And I loved it because they use a mixture of asynchronous communication, lots of documentation, meetings, and even virtual reality. Yes, people, it's here. But before that, and as we won't have had the intro, because this is a kind of a bonus episode, we have so many bonuses that they're not bonuses anymore, but a little bit of schedule. Let me introduce myself. My name is Pilar Orti. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, which is the company behind this podcast. And if you are listening to us for the first time, the 21st Century Work-Life podcast has been going since 2014. And we look at leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. So Virtual Not Distant is the company behind this show, and we have been advocating for an office optional approach for a while, and that involves helping managers and their teams introduce online collaboration practices. And we are now about to launch the Podcasting for Connection service, which is all about helping organizations keep their people connected through audio in a truly community-driven, values-driven, culture-driven show. So virtualnotdistant.com is the place for you to have a look at. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that because this is a very meaty subject today. But before we go over to Nadia's conversation, I wanted to highlight a piece of research that has recently been done. I don't even know, I think it's still a working paper, but it's called, very, very pertinent to today's topic. The name of the paper is Virtual Water Coolers, a field experiment on virtual synchronous interactions and performance of organizational newcomers. And this is being published by the Harvard Business School Technology and Operations Management. I'll put a link in the show notes to the article that summarizes it, which has a link to the paper should you wish to dig into it. And Maya and myself comment on this paper in next week's episode, on the What's Going On episode. But in essence, it does make a difference to have interns, in this case, so newcomers to the organization, and managers, more senior people, mingling, having virtual coffees. These are all about synchronous interactions. It makes a difference to have that. So check this out because it's very pertinent to today's topic. So, as I said earlier, I am delighted to introduce to you Nadia Vatalidis, who's the Director of People at Remote. And it's the first time that she's appeared on the show. And she is based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. So before she goes into how they onboard people into Remote, Nadia is going to share a little bit about the context of the company, what the company does, and also how she started off working remotely and how her environment responded to it.
I've been one of those fortunate people that got to join the remote world about 5 years ago. And being out here in South Africa, I always saw myself as someone potentially not being able to work for like a Silicon Valley tech startup. And so it's just been incredible to be part of organizations that are remote friendly, that are distributed and inclusive of people all over the world. So that it's just been a really exciting journey the last few years. And I am super excited to be part of Remote. I mean, I love that we have this ambitious name combined with this industry. And Remote is a organization that actually basically brings local wealth to people that would just like myself, would never get opportunities to work for amazing companies out there. And so with the world changing and these new normals that we're seeing, companies are becoming a lot more open and adapting to distributed work and hiring people in locations that they might have never hired before. And so what we do is when you want to hire those amazing people, we then do everything else. So from the onboarding journey to ensuring that from a compliance perspective, the correct employment agreements are done and everything else, including payroll. So we do everything else once you've hired that person, and we do so all over the world.
Wonderful. So now that I've heard you, I want to go back just a little bit about you.
Yeah.
Because you were saying that, so 5 years ago, more or less the same time that I've been in the space, that many of the people appearing on this podcast, some of them a little bit longer, but that's a good time to have entered a space when we could see it was ready, and now to be in the middle of it exploding. And so how did it look in South Africa being a remote worker? Is this something that was common pre-pandemic, something that was acceptable? How does society view the concept of working for people that are not even in your country?
I think if I look at all the moms that were at school with my kids 5 years ago, and even some of my friends, I think they genuinely believed I was a stay-at-home mom that had like this small side gig and not really a career. And I don't necessarily think it was completely accepted at that point. People grew to the fact that, look, I'm extremely passionate and very, I would nearly say very open and very public about how much I love this distributed environment. So I talk about it all the time. And so in my small network of friends and family, I've been able to create a lot of education and knowledge around how this works. And a fun fact, like when I took this opportunity, I think the first thing my parents asked me, and I mean, I'm a married woman, right? But at that point, they asked me, so you found a job on the internet and, how are you going to get paid? And so it was just so funny how it was still completely taboo in our location. I think that's changed a bit. I'm seeing a lot of companies embracing it now. Even large banks and larger corporates are still remote in South Africa. It's very difficult in really congested spaces to go back. And so I've seen quite a few companies embrace it, but then I've also seen the complete opposite, where it's still quite sort of messy. Half the teams can go in to the office, then half the team stay at home, and then they switch. And so it's very rotational. And I think it's not no one has discovered a very simple way of doing it locally yet. I obviously hope to encourage and change that over time and provide some great motivation as to why more companies should embrace it locally as well. But yeah, I think we're still in that sort of chaotic mode in my local community. My husband, for example, is still working remotely. I'm really impressed that his organization has allowed it for this long. It's been more than a year now. What their small company has decided is not to go back to the office. So that was exciting to see in a local community. And I hope it will be embraced by more. I know it's very difficult in more manufacturing type of environments. And we in South Africa, we have a ton of that. And sort of, manufacturing, all kinds of things that really require people to be at a specific space. But in the more corporate office environments, I hope it will certainly be embraced more.
Yeah, that's something that was one conversation that we had also pre-pandemic, is the percentage of society that can embrace or can even try out remote work will affect how society views it, of course, because we have lots of hospitality, manufacturing. Those are jobs that can't be done from anywhere. So that affects how we view this kind of work. So yeah, nice point as well, how that sits within the broader landscape of work. Oh, thank you. I'm just really curious always because I'm so London centric, very UK centric, and we hear a lot about what's going on in the US, and I'm quite in touch with what's happening in Spain. But anytime I can get an opportunity to, how is it being lived in other places? And I don't think I've spoken on the podcast with anyone from South Africa. So awesome. Great. So how many people work for remote, and what's the distribution worldwide? Just give us a little bit of a feeling of what your ecosystem is people-wise.
So we currently just over 130 team members globally, and we're already in 25 countries. I think that's extremely exciting. I've worked at other environments that were distributed from this sort of early stage, but not close as much. So maybe in like 10 or 11 countries, but not 25. And we're scaling. We're currently going through quite a bit of growth. We're also adding new entities to those 25 that I mentioned, even now in Q1. And that country page of how we're scaling is actually publicly available, which is really cool to see like which entities are we adding next and why. And the ecosystem here is we have a public handbook that we've embraced to make sure folks can really get a feeling for how we work. Pilar, we have a group of values that we utilize in really everything we do, and I call those nearly the boundaries of our environment. So a lot of companies would probably refer to this as company culture. But to me, because we have such amazing different cultures already at Remote across 25 countries, it's important to just recognize that our environment is made up by this sort of boundaries of values. So we use that in our environment and in this space. As we continue to scale, we're also ambitious. And for that reason, we continuously adding folks in new locations. And we want to continuously remain very distributed. We're not planning to have any offices anywhere in the world. And in fact, the way we started as one or two people, our founders, they also started in a remote distributed fashion off the bat. And so I always think that's a good foundation if you want to be remote and you do it from the start, way easier than from hybrid or office to remote. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about our environment and ecosystem.
So now I'm going to go way off script.
Go for
because
it.
you mentioned, I find it really interesting, this concept of course, of culture in all organizations. Now, you mentioned how there are some values in the company. And of course, there's a feeling, because culture for me is like, okay, how do we do things? How does it feel to be here? And you're saying because you're distributed over all these places where they have their unique, how does it feel to do stuff here? How do you manage that? I mean, manage is a terrible word, but how do you, as director of people, keep an eye out that it feels like you are in the company remote, but at the same time, we're embracing the fact that there is such diversity in how different people, because of the different upbringings, see the world. How do you navigate that?
I think firstly, it's super important that you align your people leaders and anyone managing people or have people reporting into them very closely of what it's like to manage remote teams across distributed time zones and across so many different cultures. So create a ton of awareness around that from the start is super important. And as you have new leaders joining, also making sure that you bring them into this like remote and distributed environment and how things are done in that way. How do you start your one-on-one conversations? How do you give feedback to different cultural backgrounds? What should you be sensitive to? What should you be open-minded about? So I think it all really starts with your people leadership team and making sure they own the space with me as a director of people, and that I'm not, completely on my own talking about values or driving our values forward. I have great support from our executive team in terms of values, but I'll give you a very tactical example of how we create this feeling, right? So when I joined Pilar, I thought like it's probably important to start figuring out how are people feeling? How are they doing? We're still stuck in a pandemic. They're all working from home. Their countries are potentially going sort of back and forth in this lockdown environment. And so we created a very small people feedback survey, which is really the start to an engagement survey. We're not quite there yet. I kept it very simple and very short. And we tied that back to values. So every question in that survey ties back to a specific value at Remote. So when we get that feedback, we can figure out what value do we need to continuously work on. And so I think that's just been really great to use it in a daily way. If you think about how remote teams uses different platforms to communicate in, we use Slack at remote.com. And with our transparency value, for example, we would ask questions in public channels. For instance, if someone has a question in their onboarding experience, they'll know to go to the people channel in Slack and ask all their questions publicly. And not only does this like help other people that might be either having the same questions or other people to collaborate and get that insight that these folks might have. So I feel like you've got to do values full on. You cannot just write them down on a public space or on a whiteboard or, in a wiki or wherever you're documenting your information, but using them daily. Also, from a product perspective, how we're building out our product, we utilize ambition quite a bit, which is another value. So it excites me to see how we've actually used this throughout the entire journey and not just in a public handbook that's written down. Does that answer your question?
Yes, starts to.
Awesome.
It is a huge one. What's the latest?
Awesome.
What's the last value you referred to?
Ambition.
Yes, ambition. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I just missed that. Excellent. So values drive us, of course, senior leadership and just making sure that senior leadership is supported to embrace and navigate that diversity. But at the core, I always think that if we want to celebrate and exploit in the nicest way, diversity, we've got to also be very clear about what unites us and what is common. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we know we know what our values are, we know what they look like, and we can provide the support for that as well. And we give the infrastructure to live these values within the company. Then looking at, you mentioned the use of Slack during onboarding. So let's look at that. How does a fully distributed company like Remote onboard its people? So if I joined, I've gone through the wonderful recruitment process and I've joined your company, what would happen to me on day one?
So we do use our own platform. I'm excited to say that we definitely dog food our own platform to onboard employees. And so straight after, you have signed the offer and excited to join us, and we are thrilled to have you on board, you will then get access to our platform to go through a really relatively fast journey. It can take anything from 30 minutes to probably maximum 3 hours to get through all the paperwork type things. And if I say paperwork, I mean, it's extremely digital savvy. So you'll be able to fill out information relatively quickly. If you have access to a Google Drive or something where you're storing all your personal stuff, it's super easy to just upload that or scan it in if you prefer, even with a photo on your phone, if that's the simplest way. So that starts the compliance journey to making sure that we have all the necessary information to eventually pay you once you're on board, and to make sure we can create a full employment agreement. That's part of the pre-onboarding sort of start, right? And as you go through that, you'll sign your employment agreement. That's also through a relatively easy platform to sign. Everything gets stored in our platform, and you then will receive a welcome email for day one. On that welcome email, we give a bit of direction as to what's going to happen in week one at Remote. And to me, this is probably the most important part if organizations, are onboarding people remotely, is to ensure that first week should not be about training on the job and start jumping straight into team-specific requirements. It should really be a step into the environment and the company and the values and how do we work here? How do I find information? So I find that first week is all about, in a remote company and in a distributed company, is all about self-enablement. It's all about discovering information and figuring out where to find what. Our onboarding journey, we actually use Notion, interestingly, to create an onboarding card with a bunch of key things that has to happen. Some of them are highlighted as compliance steps to do our security compliance training, or other necessary training that has to happen in week one. Other steps are key things like, how do I schedule time off in this environment? Where do I go? Who do I ask? If I have a question, what do I do? And this is really the part where we start that journey between, hey, you have a people manager that you can ask anything to, and then you have the people team that you can ask anything to. So those are your two key go-to folks so that the confusion of what to do when I need help is gone. And we have a continuous journey into the social engagement side. It's so incredibly important that you start building social connection immediately when you join an organization like ours or other remote companies. And so we go straight into this like social journey. We use coffee chats to do that. I absolutely love that the community internally is quite good at also scheduling with new hires. So whether they're in their teams or not, I remember in my first 3 weeks at Remote, I had a ton of people just scheduling coffee chats with me to get to know me and to ask me questions and to just talk about things that I'm interested in. And so I feel like it's a really great opportunity to start building relationships in that first week and first 2 weeks as well. It's not a week to have a meeting heavy week. It's all about really just enabling and empowering someone to be successful in our environment.
You were saying that when you joined, you had lots of people saying, do you want to have a coffee and stuff? How do people reach out to new hires? Is it because they are present in Slack? How do I know that someone new has joined my company?
So every people manager would announce their new hires in our general channel in Slack. We're still small enough to leverage the general channel to celebrate and welcome new folks. And so on the morning of that person's start, they will receive a welcome message, and everyone at Remote will start sending welcome messages on that thread in Slack. And so it becomes like a very warm welcome. We also from there on, we also utilize our all hands call, which happens every Wednesday. And we have started rotating it, which excites me. So all hands is now APAC, EMEA friendly. And then on a rotational week, it's also EMEA Americas friendly. So later in EMEA and then earlier in EMEA the next week. And so in that call, we would actually do a live welcome. Those calls are also recorded. So it's definitely not forced. If someone cannot attend for whatever reason, they can always watch it later. They can also contribute to the agenda if they're unable to be there. And if a manager cannot welcome their team member because they're in an odd time zone for whatever reason or they're unavailable, then someone else on the team can do that. And so we make a big deal about welcoming someone in. And then to schedule is so easy. We utilize Google Calendar. And we use Find a Time quite often with our Google Cal. And so anyone can schedule with me at any time. They can literally find a time in my calendar. My calendar is accessible to everyone at Remote. And so to ensure that they can not schedule over family time or over a meeting that I'm having like now. And so I find like it's self-enabled. It's a space where you can just find a time and schedule it. You don't have to ask before you schedule. Our CEO and our CTO has an executive business administrator that assists with calendaring to make sure we don't overschedule for them. Mm-hmm. And I also utilize work blocks to make sure that I still have time to get work done in between all these awesome calls and stuff.
Excellent. I've got one more question before we go back at the stuff that happens in the onboarding process. Well, it's not a question. It's more of a reflection of because. If for the people who are new to the space, and we've picked up lots of new listeners over the last year, it's worth seeing how structured your communication system is and how you make it really easy for everyone to find what they need at any point. And I think this is something that's often missed and that has been missed when making the transition to a more sustainable type of remote, is that the idea is to create that space in the company where whenever anyone needs any kind of information, they've got a very good chance of knowing where it is and designing the company like that. So I thought it was just worth pointing that out.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. I think it's got to be so intentional. You've got to make sure this person has a roadmap. Otherwise, it's very hard to set them up for success. And I always say a good indication of knowing when to write something down is if it's stuck in your head, and if you go on vacation and all new hires need this, you are going to be the single source of failure and they won't be able to do this one thing. And so I find like just utilizing that even in my own team, if we think about what has to be an onboarding, it's like, what does every new hire need when they join Remote? We've also been partnering very closely with our people leadership team. So that second week then becomes all about team onboarding. and they start the journey in the team. And so then it becomes way more position specific, which I like because it's a good flow from company-wide onboarding and remote onboarding into like a team environment and more specific training.
That thing about what's in my head that if I left tomorrow, people would miss, whether it's for onboarding or otherwise. This is such a key. Another thing that's missed about working online is that you cannot hold information in your head or in your computer. So, and documenting processes that we've just been doing, and we've integrated them into our being, but actually we do need to bring them out, dissect them, and document them. I mean, a lot of people, when I mention the word documentation, they go, oh. but that's how you need to work. You need to work with that when you're working online, especially distributed across time zones, etc. It's so important. So we're in week 2. We're in week 2 with our team. So what else happens around then, Nadia?
In week 2, you start getting, you're invited to the team meetings. You start having one-on-ones. You can have one-on-ones from week 1 with your manager, right? But that's really where you start embracing the environment, your position a little bit more, where I know where things live. I'm no longer confused about how this works. I've now sort of covered all the tools and all the platforms. Then you can start actually figuring out, okay, once I have to take on a project or a task, where do I do that? So during week 2, it's further discovering into the actual team space. Our hiring managers are great partnering. So for instance, our sales enablement team is building out onboarding just for sales folks so that in week 2, they can kick that off and ramp our entire sales team up to be client ready. So I feel like it's just a really good journey from there on. And this is, as you set people up for success, there's a certain amount of ownership that comes with it as well, right? So if someone at that point is still confused or needs information, this is a key time to reach out and speak up and say, hold on, I still don't know how to do this, or I still don't know where to find that. Luckily, as you mentioned earlier about documenting processes, we've embraced new tools. So we also use Loom. I find where companies just write things down and use no other content, you do miss out on a certain percentage of your internal community and your employees that are maybe slightly more driven towards either listening content or video content where they can read and watch. And so what we've done is we use Loom for 1 to 5 minute videos. And this is great to share an update, like whether that's on our platform or a feature change or a client, a key thing about how our clients will onboard or a key thing about how the employee would onboard. We then use Loom for that. And so not only are you servicing the audience that loves written content and that can totally cope only with that, but you also serve that audience, mostly not engineering, right? That's very operational, but that likes listening and working to get an update. And I usually do all my team related updates in the morning. So I listen to them first in my day. And then every morning, that's what I do, right? I listen to all the updates. I quickly read through anything key that my team should be aware of or that we should make changes on, and then carry on with my day. So that's been great. And in our what I wanted to say is in our onboarding journey, we use Loom a lot. So every team has actually created a short Loom video, very impactful. So again, 1 to 5 minutes that someone can watch about what does this team do at Remote? So what does our growth marketing team do? What does the people team do at Remote? What does the product team work on? And so it's really great to introduce even like, what do they look like? Who's in the team? So that's been really awesome to discover here. And also for their own team to discover like, what does their own team do? How do they do updates? All of that can then be shared in this like short video clip. But yeah, all our processes are written down. So that also helps a new team member to follow through. If there's like something they want to jump in straight away, they'll be able to read through the documentation and do it.
The asynchronous video, I'm also up a lot for audio. There's still so much to exploit in that. And I think that companies in the past maybe have shied away. Traditional companies have definitely shied away. But hopefully one thing that the last year has opened up is people getting in front of a camera, looking like they normally look.
Yeah.
With whatever lighting they have, whatever audio they have. And hopefully that experience will mean that companies thinking about either having remote employees or being fully distributed, or even companies that are still using the office, to think about, okay, how can we make communication through tech that is asynchronous, so not real time, which basically gives us the flexibility to connect where we are ready to connect. How can we make that experience as humane as possible, as personal as possible? And so, yes, video, audio, as well as accompanying for text. I think, yes, as well as the diversity of how people like to engage. I think that's really great. That's, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Great. Now, one other thing that, let me, I want to talk to you about the VR headsets, but anything else we need to touch on? Is that part of your onboarding? Or does it come later on? With VR.
To ship those amazing Oculus VRs has been interesting. I have to admit, especially during the pandemic, we have an amazing tech ops leader that has found very creative ways to get this shipped all over the world, and sometimes find local ways to get a VR Oculus, straight to the person. But we did use it very recently in our sales kickoff event. And so, like companies call a yearly SKO, so that's your sales kickoff for the year, they used VR in that training and in nearly as a method to engage and have fun while training and kicking off the annual sales year. So in December, we also used it quite a bit, and we use it for gaming and social engagement, certainly enough. I think there's a lot more to come, and we're getting better at getting the equipment faster. We certainly hope to make it part of onboarding in future. Something that you can do in your first week, which is a ton of fun. Every Thursday, we have a gaming opportunity internally. And I mean, everyone loves a good sort of Beat Saber on VR. And so that is actually an opportunity to learn from others and just join and have a ton of fun, and also get to know your colleagues. I really like how everyone's, how everyone sort of creates themselves in VR. And it also embraces all the diversity ultimately, because everyone looks so different, even in VR, right? So it's such a great opportunity to kind of get socially connected with people at remote as well. So that's something you can do in your first week. Certainly, we encourage it so much. And we always hope to have, all your equipment by day one. Things like your hardware, like your laptop and your second screen, those things has to happen on day one. But the fun things sometimes do get slightly delayed by the pandemic, unfortunately, and postal services. But we're getting there. We're becoming very creative in finding ways to get it to people.
And the VR experience, you're basically going into a virtual reality world, and you've got your own little avatars. I think you were featured in a BBC website article, so we'll link in the show notes. So what does it look like? What do you choose about your avatar?
So ultimately, I love how that BBC article described, like, I couldn't quite get my hair the way I wanted it in real life. That was so funny, and it's so true, right? So you work with the creativity that you have in VR to create your own avatar. People certainly try to make it look like them. So it's cool to see how we can nearly start recognizing each other in VR, and how different everyone creates their own themselves. So yeah, it's just, I know Joop even had a live session on the BBC in that article with the journalist that was hosting that call. So yeah, it's just an incredible experience. I really, really hope we can utilize it way more, especially if you think about the learning and development journey at a company and how you can use that in a very creative way to engage people, and less boring. I think it's really fun and a completely different way to engage people.
Yeah, it's a real welcome to your world. also. It's like, these are some of the things, and it also sends a very strong, you were talking one of your values about being ambition.
Yes.
It really says, look, we are a distributed company. We rely on technology to create the best experience while we're working together. This is one of the things that technology has, and we're experimenting with it. So I think it sends a very, very strong signal. So Nadia, I hope listeners have a very good idea of what the onboarding journey looks like. How do you work with your clients to help them design this?
Yeah, so our clients won't follow our sort of internal employee onboarding journey, but they will certainly use the same product as us. Mm-hmm. And so we're not going to do a cultural onboarding for them, if that makes sense, or a values onboarding. What we highly focus on is making it this amazing user experience. Our platform is very product savvy, it's very sort of UX and UI designed to create a very seamless onboarding journey for someone that is starting with a new company and that needs to fill out information. And traditionally, that always takes very long. It's usually very back and forth on email or very sort of glitchy. And our platform has just taken away all of that and made it completely seamless and super quick to get them live into the platform. Companies as well. So they will then have access to their employee data, and they'll be able to upload additional documentation. For instance, if someone is promoted and they want to store that in our platform, so they could utilize it for more than just the onboarding journey. And we have payroll in the tool as well, and we're working currently on even having expenses approved within our platform. So you could approve all your expenses for your employees in the platform as well. So that makes payroll just absolutely seamless. And instead of using like a whole bunch of third parties or intermediaries, it's all, in one space. So it does remove, I think it just removes a lot of sort of manual work from a company.
Yeah, that's great. You're really taking the time away from the paperwork, we'll call it that.
Yeah.
And so people can put actually the time into the things that matter. So Nadia, this is wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to tell listeners, either about your own journey or your experience or remote? So
to me, Pilara, I think I would encourage all your listeners, if they are business owners or organizations that are currently really thinking through talent and hiring, that they start considering global talent and start thinking about the amazing talent they're missing out on in locations that they've never even considered. It's certainly possible to hire in the most interesting locations. And again, remote.com, the country page is live. It gives you a very good idea of where we're going next. And so I would encourage people to start thinking about adding talent in new locations, and not just in the locations where they potentially had offices before, or if they're now gone all remote, it's really opening opportunities to have distributed teams. And that, I feel like, yes, that creates organic diversity, but it's also intentional. I feel like there's an intentional part here that creates the opportunity to have multiple cultures work for you, multiple fresh set of eyes on the work that you're doing, and fresh ideas. And yeah, I'm very passionate about that part. And I hope I encourage folks today to consider that.
And listeners, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Thank you, Nadia, for sharing in so much detail that onboarding process and also your personal experience of the space, and for reminding us the potential of really embracing a way of making remote work and the benefits that can bring. Of course, listeners, you can connect with Nadia over at LinkedIn, Nadia Vatalidis, and on Twitter, she's Nadia Vat, and you can check out even everything that Remote does over at remote.com. Now, if you are a new listener, I recommend that you listen to the episode that was released just before this one, 276, which is all about hiring for a distributed team. So it's a great complement. And if you want to know more about the onboarding process, then you can check out an episode that we released back at the beginning of 2020 on the 16th of January. And it's called onboarding or integration in remote teams and organizations. And it features Marcus Vermuth, Mark Kilby, and Mandy Gardner. And they share different ways of onboarding into a virtual or distributed organization. So again, a wonderful complement to today's episode. And so that is indeed the end of the episode. Remember to subscribe to the show, 21st Century Work Life, in whatever podcast app you use. Although if you are on Apple Podcasts, we will be down as follow because subscribe now means that you have a paid subscription for extra content. So I would love to offer that as well. I would love to generate some income directly from the podcast rather than indirectly. Sometimes this show results in new collaborations and even client work. So that's great. And it would be great to be able to release more content in whatever capacity, but we don't have that capacity. But if you or your organization would like to partner up with us to release more content, let me know. Because I said this a couple of years ago, and Tim Burgess listened and he said, "Hey, I've got an idea." We talked and we ended up releasing a 7-part episode series on connection and disconnection in remote teams. So all about preventing more than tackling loneliness. So maybe you've got a topic or something that you would like to explore, and we might be the right partner. So let us know. And if you want to stay in touch, every month we have a newsletter with reading and listening recommendations, plus a digest of our own content. And you can sign up to that over at virtualnotdistant.com. And when you sign up to that, you get a free PDF, Leading Through Visible Teamwork, which is a short guide as an introduction to those set of principles. You can follow us on LinkedIn. On Twitter, we are at Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O. And if you want to use good old email, my address is pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Now, listeners, we know that there's so many shows and very good podcasts out there now that tackle online collaboration, remote work, whatever you want to call it. So the fact that you are here right to the end of this episode means a lot to me. So thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.